What would it be like to be a media writer and podcast producer? Now, if you haven't been living under a rock these last 4 or 5 years, you've probably noticed that this whole podcasting thing is probably here to stay. I mean, in the near future, within the US alone, you're looking at over 100 million active podcast listeners. Yeah. What does that mean? That means this whole industry is taking shape before our very eyes. And I kind of wanted to get ahead of it from a careers perspective. So that's what this episode's about. I've lined up this great guest. His name is Chad Chenail, and he's been in the industry for about 6 or 7 years now. And not only in the industry, he's been doing stuff like winning Webby Awards, which if you're not familiar, that's like a Grammy. Aside from that, he's worked with some of the biggest names in the industry, such as Wondery and Spotify and a bunch of others. So today's conversation, the highlights of it at least, are going to be delving into some of that stuff, the rewards, the challenges, what it's like, and not only that, his role. He's got this really specialized niche within children's media. So this episode, I think is going to be a great one. But I mean, as always, I do encourage you to check out the full-length audio version. There's just so much more contained within that 45-minute talk. And you can find that wherever you access your podcast. Just do that search for Life as a ... All right, well, I think it's about time to get into things, so why don't we? All right, well, I'd like to open things up here by getting us all on the same page. And here's a clip of Chad explaining what a media writer is. What does that mean? As well as a podcast producer. So check it out.
And I think no matter what type of content creator, content writer you are always kind of imagining that audience. And for me, that audience is young people. It's kids and children. And so, yeah, being able to specify that I'm a content writer. I write mostly for podcasts. I have written books and I continue to do so. But all of the things I write do have that common audience member in mind. So that's kind of the connective tissue for me.
I mean, producer at times is this big catch-all word, and kind of you were alluding to. I'd be curious about like some of the responsibilities that may be a little bit unusual based, project to project or whatever you're working on that kind of go beyond what like the stock definition that we just went over.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was interesting for me. I have a background in theater, and so I came from, the theater world in New York, and a producer was the person who had the money and paid the bills, and that is very different in podcasting. Sometimes the producer does have the money on an indie pod, but for the most part, a producer is someone who is really making the thing happen. And so sometimes that's very hands-on, and a producer can bring a recording device to a location and interview a person or, work with actors for a scripted show and kind of direct that performance or cast that performance. It really depends on what you're doing, but I think of producing as making the product itself and doing whatever kind of needs to happen in order to make that show, whatever the show might be.
Well, hopefully those last two clips there kind of give you a good idea of what a media writer is all about, as well as a podcast producer. Now, I did want to kind of dive into the weeds a little bit further with Chad and find out some of his actual roles and responsibilities, things that he's doing right now. And I might add that he's working on about 3-4 different programs at the same time. So here's another clip of kind of diving a little bit deeper to get a better perspective on the type of work he's involved in.
Doing guest outreach based on who the host is interested in talking to, trying to coordinate those schedules and get everyone in the same room at the same time to record, which is a challenge.
I know about this.
Yes, yeah. So booking is a big part of it for some shows. It hasn't been in the past. It just happens to be for me right now. And at that show, I also do edit after the interview, and so I'll cut down an hour-long conversation into half an hour, 45 minutes. Clear out all the breaths and the ums and the sneezes and things like that, and just make sure the conversation is flowing. And so if we take a really unexpected left turn, like we have to try and figure out, does it make sense as a listener following? If not, should we cut that left turn and just try and keep a single topic? Things like that. So that's a pretty standard task that a producer would do. For other shows, I am just a writer, and so I just had a meeting this morning where we're talking about an episode of a kids podcast that's going to be about springtime and what does it mean when spring comes and why do things come to life all of a sudden? What's the science
Mhm.
behind it? What are some of the myths behind it? And so I'm writing tales like that.
Yeah.
And I am doing sound design. And so a big part of it as well is fiction podcasts, some of which I've written, some of which I haven't written, getting all the actors' vocals in, organizing all the vocals, putting music behind it, putting footsteps, putting sound
Yeah.
design, and kind of bringing that fictional world to life. That is definitely my favorite part of it, but
Sounds
not the
fun.
part that you get to do the most. That's sort of like the finishing touches.
Never good. It
But it's,
never works that way, does it?
I know the most fun thing is not the thing you spend your whole day
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
But that is also for a fiction pod pretty standard for a producer to do work like that.
Put the icing on the cake as far as giving you this holistic look at the type of work that Chad's involved in. Here's a clip of him explaining how he structures his week as far as some of the roles and responsibilities that he has. So check it out.
My day is very different depending on when my due dates are. And so I might talk about it as a week because that tends to be a little bit more consistent.
Sure.
But a couple of the shows that I work on have weekly check-in meetings. And so we'll all just get together with everyone who's on the show and talk about what episode we're working on or talking about what's going to happen that week. And so I'll have 2 or 3 of those meetings per week, one for each show. And I try and split up my day based on the task that I feel best prepared for and not necessarily like the show that I'm working on. And so for me, I'm not the most creative in the mornings. I'm not a huge morning person. And so it's a little indulgent, but I do start my workday around like 9 or 10. And those first couple hours for me are administrative stuff. I'm
Yeah.
following up on my emails, I'm making invoices. Any type of booking that I might have to do, I find a little bit administrative. And so I do that kind of stuff in the morning. And then I'll take a little bit of a lunch with my dog and come back and get into some of the more creative work. And so maybe that will be writing a script, maybe it will be sound designing an episode, maybe it'll be filling out grant information or pitching a new show to someone. But whatever that kind of creative work is, I tend to do like a 12 to 3 or 12 to 4 time slot to really kind of crank out some of those fun projects. And then
Yeah.
depending on how due something is, it might be a 7 p.m. pickup to like finish the job and get it across the finish line before the next day. Unfortunately, it's not the most uncommon thing to have to do, but I
Mm.
try and avoid it whenever possible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I like that. I think it gives great perspective for listeners, in terms of how things are structured. But even beyond that, I also like the point of knowing yourself, knowing when is going to be the best time for creative work, when is a better point for you to be doing, like you said, the administrative and some of the things that, don't require as much creative thought, perhaps. I think that's an important sort of lesson.
As I mentioned at the top, Chad has garnered a lot of award and accolade. He's also worked for top companies in the industry. Just flat out, he's good at what he does. Now, I want to know what he attributes his success to. Now, his answer is probably my favorite part of this conversation because I think it is incredibly insightful and really, really helpful to anyone who's listening, whether you're interested in podcasting or that industry or any industry. I think this insight, this wisdom is really, really solid gold. So have a listen, lean into this one.
That I think a big part of it for me is being mission driven. I think so many people want to work in kids content that it really is a privilege to break through and to be able to work in children's content. And I think a lot of it is skill and hard work. Like you said, a lot of it is luck. And so being, grateful to be here is something that you'll find across the kids media industry. Everyone's just like really happy to be doing the work they're doing, grateful to do the work that they're doing, and in my experience, take it very seriously. And so I think taking kids content seriously, taking kids seriously, and having sort of a strong mission or a strong why behind why you're driven to do this and what you're hoping to accomplish really helps you both in those networking conversations where you're trying to talk to someone who's in the industry about, what makes you special or what makes you want to do it, having all of that kind of established for yourself not only like gets me up in the morning, but I think people respond to it and can see it in the conversations that I have and in the type of work that I try and make.
Yeah, yeah. Well, passion certainly goes a long ways, and it's in almost every book of business or entrepreneurship. It certainly plays a big role. And like you said, I like that point. You notice it within people, and I think that that's a spark unto itself and allows for discussion to go further, and certainly for, like you said, networking opportunities.
I think one step further, passion is really important, but it's also very broad, And so like you can be passionate about something, but why are you passionate about it and what are you hoping to accomplish are really important questions. I think if you want to work in media, and like I'm passionate about kids content for sure, but what I want to do is make an opportunity for every type of child to see themselves in the work that they're watching, in the work that I'm making. And so that like very specific goal is actionable, shows, I guess it doesn't show much, but it helps to keep me focused on the type of projects I want to take on, and it helps people keep me in mind for specific types of projects, as opposed to
Great.
someone who's just wanting to do a little bit of everything. You might be applicable for more things, but you might not be the first person to come to mind.
There you go. I think in a roundabout way, you just answered that original question that I asked, what you attribute your success to. I think it's maybe a mindset like that, like I think that really distinguishes a lot of people. I think that's such a great point. You could be passionate about something, as you said, but if it's just really general, that can get you a certain point. But when you kind of refine it and narrow it down to something and you have this mission attached to it, like you said, that's actionable, like that's where a lot of the results can be derived from. So yeah, I like that. I think it's a
Yeah,
really, really
I
great point
definitely agree.
there.
I was super passionate about theater, but I wasn't trying to accomplish anything in my theater career, and I think that definitely was noticeable.
Now, I just told you that last clip represented one of my favorite parts of this conversation. Well, this next one's not too far behind because I think it is fundamentally important insofar as finding rewarding work, finding a career that has meaning. And it all revolves around this notion of mission. If you can find a mission and attach yourself to it within your work, you're way ahead of the pack.
I have this other question here. In researching for this talk, I came to understand that, inclusion and representation are important aspects to the work that you do. In fact, you note them to be guiding principles. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you mean by this.
Yeah, totally. I think this plays in a lot to the sort of mission-driven work that I was talking about earlier. But for me, representation is the cornerstone of why I do children's content. I think as a queer person, I was growing up and I did not have a ton of role models, especially in children's content. I did not have role models, but even the one thing I can think of was watching Graham Norton's late night talk show growing up, and that was not for kids. And so it's not positive childhood representation of queer people, right?
Yeah.
And that led me to be ashamed for a number of years of who I was. I thought it was something that was a defect, something that was not right, something I need to hide. And I think just the simple fact of seeing someone who was like me exist in the media, in a cartoon, on a TV show, would have saved me a lot of time in trying to untangle those feelings. And that lesson for me applies to all types of representation. And so queer representation in kids' content, I think, is very important and is a very polarizing conversation right now, especially. But I have taken that moment to say, okay, we need better representation for all types of children, for people who are differently abled, people who are disabled, people, just of any type of background. It's really important to be able to see yourself in the media you're consuming. Otherwise, you don't know what's possible. And so that for me is really why kids content is so important. You still have time to tell a child that they are valid before they develop any feelings otherwise. And so I think, yeah, that's why representation is a guiding principle for me.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's absolutely, powerful, I think, for children to hear that for all the reasons that you just outlined. I mean, critically important. And it's encouraging to hear that this is an area that is, developing further. I mean, still has a long ways to go in terms of children's media, perhaps, but the fact that you are still able to be, building this into your work and allowing it to come through is, it's going to be special, not only for yourself, of course, but for the people that you are reaching, for those children that are able to identify with this character and find some commonality and, gain some sort of level of power themselves from it. Yeah, it must be a wonderful thing to be part of.
Well, in an attempt to kind of keep these highlight videos somewhat short, I think it might be a nice time to draw this one to a close. But if you've been enjoying it, I definitely encourage you to check out the full-length audio version. There we get into it. Really interesting story that Chad shares. We also dive a little bit deeper in terms of some of the rewards and some of the challenges and a bunch more. And you can find that episode wherever you access your podcast. Just do that search for Life as a ... All right, and one more thing while I got your attention here, I would really, really love that like or subscribe. Okay, well, I will have another video coming for you right next week, so don't miss it. We'll see you then.